In a mountain village outside Nagano, there is a woman who is 81 years old. Her skin is not tight in the way that suggests a procedure. It is smooth in the way that suggests nothing was ever broken in the first place. Her neighbors do not think she looks young. They think she looks the way a woman her age is supposed to look, which is something most of us have forgotten is even possible. She has been doing the same thing every night for 60 years. It costs her less than $3 a month. That number is not a marketing hook. It is not an approximation. It is what the ingredient actually costs when you buy it the way she buys it, unbranded, unpackaged, from the same supplier her mother used. And it is the number that should make you stop and ask why. If something this old and this inexpensive actually works, every dermatologist in the United States spent the last 4 decades pointing you somewhere else. That question is the reason this channel exists. What I am about to describe does not come from a wellness blog, a Japanese skincare brand sold at an American department store, or a sponsored post dressed up as research. The practices I'm describing come from the daily lives of women in Okinawa Prefecture, the traditional districts of Kyoto, and the rural communities of Nagano, places where these methods have never been replaced by anything modern, because nothing modern has proven worth the trade. These women are not avoiding modern skincare as a philosophy. They simply looked at what was being offered and found it unconvincing compared to what they already had. What they have always had is fermented rice bran. In Japanese, it is called nuka. And before you decide you already know this story, I want to be precise about what nuka is, how it works on skin that is past 60, and exactly when and why it disappeared from the conversation you were allowed to have. Nuka is the thin layer of bran removed from brown rice when it is milled into white rice. It is rich in a compound called gamma-oryzanol, in vitamin E, in ferulic acid, and in a class of lipids that are structurally close to the skin's own natural oils. The fermentation process, and this distinction matters, converts these compounds into smaller molecular forms that pass through the outer skin barrier more efficiently than many of the synthesized actives in premium creams. This is not a new finding. Japanese biochemists documented this property decades ago. What is new is the willingness to say it plainly in a format that reaches the people it most concerns. Women in the Edo period, beginning in the 17th century, used nuka in their bathing ritual as a matter of course. They carried small cloth bags filled with fermented rice bran and pressed them against the skin during washing. This was not considered beauty care in the way we use that phrase now. It was considered basic hygiene, the same way we consider soap. Basic hygiene. The difference is that their version of soap left behind a lipid-rich film that fed the skin rather than stripping it. Over decades, the cumulative effect of that daily application is what you see on the face of the woman in Nagano. Now, I want to stop here because there is a version of this story that gets told quickly and badly, the version that says the Japanese were simply lucky or that their genetics explain everything. That version is convenient and it is incomplete. The women in these communities do not have fundamentally different skin biology from a woman in Ohio or North Carolina. What they have is a different 400-year accumulation of daily habit. Here is the number that changes everything. The FDA did not substantially update its cosmetics regulation framework between 1938 and 2022. That is 84 years during which the agency that was supposed to protect American women from ineffective and potentially harmful products held the same legal standard it had written before penicillin existed. 84 years. During that window, the American cosmetics industry was allowed to grow into a market worth over $60 billion annually, with almost no requirement to prove that anything it sold actually did what it claimed. That window is where the buried becomes buried. In 1976, the cosmetics industry created a panel called the Cosmetic Ingredient Review. The name sounds regulatory. It is not. It was funded from its founding by the Personal Care Products Council, which is the industry's own trade association. The panel reviewed ingredients and issued safety assessments, but it had no enforcement power. It could not remove an ingredient from the market. It could not compel a reformulation. It was, in practice, a credibility shield, a way for brands to say that someone had reviewed their ingredients without that someone having any authority to act. As of its last published review count, the panel had examined over 4,000 ingredients. What changed after those reviews is mostly the same as what was there before. None of this directly buried Nuka. What it did was create the conditions in which expensive, patent-protected synthetic alternatives could occupy the entire visible conversation about skin aging, while something that cost $3 a month and required no laboratory and generated no shareholder return was allowed to remain invisible in American culture. There is no conspiracy in that sentence. There is only an accurate description of how incentives work. Synthetic retinol was introduced into mainstream cosmetics in 1971. Within 2 decades, it had become the most recommended anti-aging ingredient in American dermatology. Retinol works. That part is true. But retinol also causes photosensitivity, initial peeling, and significant irritation in women with thinner, post-menopausal skin, the women who were prescribed it most aggressively. Fermented rice bran was working on the same cellular turnover mechanisms for 400 years without those side effects, in a population of women whose skin tells you clearly that it was not failing them. That comparison was never made in any journal article you were handed at a dermatologist's office. I want to introduce you to someone, because the data alone does not carry what the data means until you put a face near it. There is a retired school teacher in Kyoto, 74 years old, who has 3 children and whose family has lived in the same district for 4 generations. She has been using fermented rice bran in one form or another since she was 14, first in the way her grandmother taught her, which was the cloth bag in the bath, then as a pressed paste applied for several minutes to the face before rinsing. She is not beautiful in the way a magazine would describe. She is remarkable in a more specific way. Her skin texture at 74 has the kind of fine-grained evenness that most women I have spoken to associate with women decades younger. She spends less than $5 a month on her face. When I asked her what she thought of the serums her daughter had brought back from Tokyo, she said, "They are for women who have forgotten." She was not being unkind. She was being accurate. The fermentation step is not incidental. It is the mechanism. When Nuka is fermented, typically through exposure to beneficial bacteria and naturally occurring yeasts in the bran itself, the larger molecules in the raw bran are broken down into compounds the skin can immediately use. Among those compounds is a form of ferulic acid that functions as both an antioxidant and a natural UV filter. There is also a significant concentration of ceramide precursors, ceramides being the lipid structures that hold the skin's outer barrier together. After 60, ceramide production in the skin drops significantly, which is the primary reason postmenopausal skin becomes dry, thin, and prone to the kind of microdamage that accumulates into visible aging. Fermented Nuka directly addresses that deficit, not metaphorically, chemically. This is also why the cloth bag method persisted for centuries in ways that simpler applications did not. The gentle physical action of pressing the bag against the skin drives the fermented lipids into the upper layers, without the barrier disruption that scrubbing creates. It is a delivery method that predates the cosmetic science that would eventually explain why it worked. And this is where I want to say something about the broader pattern, because Nuka is not an isolated case. Roman women in the 1st century used rice-based preparations mixed with honey for skin maintenance, documented in texts that survived. Egyptian women, specifically in the Upper Nile region, used fermented grain preparations on the skin as part of ritual bathing. Persian physicians in the medieval period wrote about the use of bran water as a treatment for irritated and aging skin. In the Ayurvedic tradition, rice bran oil appears in texts about skin longevity going back more than 1,000 years. Korean women in the Joseon dynasty used fermented grain water called fermented rice water in a daily facial rinse that Korean beauty culture has partially maintained to this day. Japanese women did not invent this. They simply never stopped using it. That distinction, preserved, not invented, is what makes the Nagano village and the Kyoto school teacher and the women of Okinawa legitimate witnesses to something that the rest of the world interrupted and then spent a great deal of money trying to sell back to. Itself. The modern J beauty market, the version with the clean pastel packaging sold in Sephora and the airport duty-free, is not this. That market understood that the authority of Japanese longevity was real and found a way to monetize it without passing on what made it real. What you got was a bottle with Japanese characters on it and a 7-step routine built around the same synthetic actives you were already using. The women in Nagano do not do a 7-step routine. They do one thing consistently for decades. That consistency is its own kind of data point. There is no ingredient, synthetic or natural, that outperforms a simple, non-irritating, lipid-replenishing habit applied daily for 60 years. The search for the breakthrough product is the thing that prevented the outcome. Every time you introduced a new acid, a new peptide, a new retinoid, you were also introducing a new disruption to the barrier you were trying to rebuild. The women who never searched for the breakthrough never disrupted the barrier. Their skin reflects that. For women over 60 specifically, this is not a minor point. Post-menopausal skin is already producing less estrogen, less collagen, less natural oil. Its margin for disruption is smaller than at any previous point in life. The aggressive intervention model that the American beauty industry sold to this demographic, stronger actives, more frequent exfoliation, intensive treatments, was the worst possible recommendation for the most vulnerable skin state in a woman's life. The gentleness of fermented nuka is not a weakness of the method. It is the reason the method works at exactly the moment the industry's recommendations started to visibly fail. I am not telling you to go buy a product. I am telling you that what the women of Nagano and Kyoto and Okinawa have been doing for centuries is documented, chemically coherent, and available for almost nothing. And that the reason it was not the first thing your dermatologist mentioned has more to do with how dermatologists receive their continuing education, often funded by the companies that sell you the alternatives, than with any deficiency in the ingredient itself. Across many cultures, women who aged with what we would now call graceful skin had one thing structurally in common. They were not fighting their skin, they were maintaining it. There is a considerable difference between those two orientations, and after 60, that difference shows up on your face. Have you ever seen this in someone from your own life, a grandmother, an aunt, a woman in your community whose skin never seemed to follow the expected aging script, and you never quite understood why? I want to hear about that in the comments. Not the cream she used, not the brand, the woman herself. And did your mother or grandmother ever use something simple and consistent that you only later understood was doing something real? Something that seemed unremarkable at the time? If you are the kind of woman who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do. The next video on this channel is going to go further back. There's a single decision made in 1938, a specific legislative compromise, a specific dollar amount, a specific exclusion written into American law that determined everything your government was and was not allowed to do about what went into every skin product sold to you for the rest of your life. The women in Nagano were not protected by that law. They did not need to be. You were told you were